A very beautiful community. The war on Russian soil is spreading. Now, you don't need to be a genius to work this out, that over time, especially the more Ukraine struggles at the front line, it's going to deepen its capacity to operate and inflict significant damage deep inside Russian territory. Now, there is a certain kind of practical and military import to this very unconventional operation, with drones smuggled in wooden boxes onto trucks and so on. And there is going to be a military component here to analyze how this might impact, if at all, Russia's nuclear triad, how much Russia's strategic aviation will be affected. I mean, some of the bombers in the fleet, like the 2160, is an aircraft of which Russia has less than a couple of dozen. There are going to be questions about Russia's geopolitical standing potentially as a result of this, but as a result of the direct depletion of military capacity. But let's analyze the symbolic meaning of this. I mean, we've talked about other symbolic events during the war, such as the attack on the Kerch Bridge, the sinking of the warship Moskva. And so this is a powerful symbolic event. And I think the first question this raises is the question of the embarrassment of the counterintelligence failure on the Russian side. We don't need to be geniuses to predict that war on Russian soil will escalate. In fact, virtually everybody watching this can see this pattern, and they failed to pick this enterprise up. The consequence will be a partly practical, partly theatrical throwing around of the buck of blame from one agency to the other. The minority radical constituency, we sometimes refer to as dead radicals, by which I mean a hodgepodge of different groups and clients of the regime and demographics, will want a response for the regime not to look weak in the face of the Europeans and the Americans. Putin's problem is that it's not clear how he can respond. He can't respond in equivalence by attacking Ukraine's large strategic aviation fleet that doesn't exist. So the most plausible pattern is simply to expect the sadistic and destructive element of Russia's attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure to take precedence over the calculated advantage, whether it's militarily or politically, dimensions of such attacks. Now, let's say something ethical that needs to be said, even though it might require ventilating a somewhat silly argument. And the argument that I've seen is that Ukraine's attack on Russia's strategic aviation is entirely understandable, but is a bit morally compromised because of its cleverness, hence giving ideas to terrorists across the globe. Now, not qualified to even analyze this practically, and one might guess that terrorists don't need ideas. They'll have plenty of their own. But I want to comment on the ethical dimension of that remark, because it constitutes an important ethical misunderstanding. Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory, the attacks on the strategic aviation, and the train attacks we saw earlier, shouldn't be thought of. We should be very, very slow to think of them as being either ethical or unethical. They're not unethical, but it's not that they're ethical either. They are beyond questions of ethical and unethical, because they are responsive to conditions of necessity, conditions of a defensive existential war, during which values like survival, national security, and sheer necessity take precedence. So it's an ethical misunderstanding of war, particularly defensive existential war, to over-ethicize the behavior of the defensive party. Now, war on Russian soil as a pattern will continue to escalate. Ukraine's capacity to engage in operations deep in Russian territory, will only escalate the more Ukraine feels stuck when it comes to the front line. The more troubled Ukraine feels there, the more it's going to bring the war onto Russian soil and cultivate its capacity to do that. That's a pattern that's going to escalate and probably culminate in things we haven't seen yet. Both strikes on military targets we haven't seen yet, and indeed potentially what we haven't yet seen, mass casualty civilian events, which are going to have political consequences and consequences for dynamics of escalation. So we're not, despite the drama of today, at the terminus of this story about war on Russian soil. It's going to escalate. The other pattern we're going to see is that there's going to be a greater sadistic element in Russia's response at the expense of constructive pursuit of the regime's own military and political aspirations. The regime's political aspirations, don't forget, are ideally speaking ungovernability in Ukraine and Ukraine's drift towards something like a Georgia predicament. But we're also going to see, because Ukraine attacking Russia is, by extension, on Putin's terms, the West attacking Russia, we're also going to see, in all likelihood, an escalation, not that we wouldn't have seen it anyway, but an escalation of Russia's hybrid operations in Europe. An interesting argument has been made, and that's that the potentially crippling nature of the damage today is an indication of the fact that Putin missed an important opportunity to consolidate his gains via the diplomatic means Trump was offering, and that Putin's rejected a reasonable hand, and his future hands will get less good. Let's analyze this very briefly from Putin's point of view and then from our own point of view of Putin's actual interest as we would see it if we were evil, but not Putin himself. Putin rejects this, partly because he sees the basic dynamics as all going in his favor. He believes that a toxification of Ukraine's domestic political environment is the likely destination. And he believes that democratic decline in the West is only going to dramatize over the next few years. And that'll mean that as European democracies decline at home, they're going to lose their capacity to operate on the foreign stage, which means that with the United States tuning out, Europe will not be able to carry Ukraine as it might wish. Putin's fairly confident of that, and so he is not going to be having big existential concerns that he has missed an opportunity to consolidate gains he might not get a chance to grasp in the future. That's Putin's view. My view is that on Putin's terms, Putin is mistaken. That's to say, Putin could have done more damage to the West and more damage to Ukraine by settling for less, by settling for some of what Trump was trying to offer, if Ukraine could have been persuaded into it, and then got the benefit of being reintegrated into the West. Losing out on some things he still wants to achieve in Ukraine would have been more than compensated for by two elements here. First, just how toxic a reintegration of Putin back into the West would have been for the West's prospects of keeping its democracies. Even if this were just a US-Russia alliance, which sort of positioned itself against Europe, this would still dramatically undermine US democracy. European democracy, because European democracy is in a somewhat domino relation with US democracy. And second, any deal that Putin could have taken would have left it entirely up to him to restart the war in the future, or indeed restart some kind of extremely low threshold provocation against NATO in Article 5 in Finland or in the Baltics in the future. So I do think that Putin has missed an opportunity. But on Putin's own terms, he hasn't, because all the big picture dynamics are going in his favor. Now you might say, well, what about the Russian economy and potential political protest at home? For now, the answer will have to be keep dreaming. because Putin's political capital at home is such that I would argue he is capable of getting away even with another large-scale forced mobilization of the kind he did in that autumn period long ago when the regime was perhaps at its weakest point during the war. Putin has probably the political capital to even do that. So the story of Russia's economic decline is not a story of immediate crisis, but it's a story of sort of a long distance sort of corrosion, radioactive damage that accumulates over years rather than sooner. That's roughly where we are with primarily our conversation about war on Russian soil, to which we'll have the opportunity to return inevitably many times in the future. Lots of love.